In the dead of night, when the streets fell silent and even the rats paused to listen, a shadow would sometimes slip through the alleys of old London. This was not a thief, not a ghost, but something worse in the eyes of many, a body snatcher. These men moved like whispers through graveyards, armed not with weapons, but with shovels, sacks, and a grim sense of purpose. They were not murderers, but they preyed on the dead. And during the age of plague, when the pits overflowed with corpses and the living barely had time to grieve, the body snatchers found both opportunity and horror beneath the soil. The plague brought death in waves. First, the Black Death of the 14th century, then the Great Plague of 1665, and again, more localized outbreaks for centuries after. When plague swept through a city, it did not knock politely. Kicked in the door, took children from their mothers, emptied households overnight, and left entire neighborhoods silent. The usual rituals of burial were cast aside in the face of overwhelming loss. Graves were no longer dug with care. Instead, mass burial pits were carved into the earth, huge trenches where bodies were stacked like firewood, layer upon layer. Lime was poured over them to help prevent the spread of disease, but the smell, the fear, and the sorrow lingered in the air. The pits were hurriedly dug, often in areas far from main churches. There was no time for prayers. Men carried corpses by the cartload, wrapped in rough cloth or naked, bloated from disease, and dumped them unceremoniously into the ground. It was a time when even death had lost its dignity. Yet despite the sheer volume of death, there were those who looked at these bodies not as victims, but as commodities. Medical schools in the 18th and 19th centuries were desperate for human cadavers. Anatomical study was expanding, but the law only allowed for the dissection of executed criminals. There simply were not enough legally available corpses to meet the demand. And so, body snatching was born out of a twisted necessity. Enter the so-called resurrectionists. Most people imagine body snatchers creeping into graveyards and digging up fresh graves. That was certainly part of it. But during outbreaks of plague, their work became easier and more grotesque. Pits, meant to contain the dead and stop the spread of infection, became buffet tables for desperate anatomists and greedy opportunists. It was horrifying, yes, but also efficient. Why dig up individual graves when entire layers of human flesh could be lifted in one go? Of course, plague pits came with their own dangers. Many believed the corpses inside could still spread disease. The mere act of disturbing these pits was considered reckless, even by other criminals. Some body snatchers fell ill and died soon after their grim work. Others wore soaked cloths over their mouths and noses, believing this would shield them from the foul miasma rising from the grave. But the profit was irresistible. Medical institutions paid handsomely for intact bodies, and in plague years, bodies were in abundant supply. The operations were brutal. The snatchers worked in pairs or teams. One would keep watch while others shoveled. There were no markers to indicate who was buried where. They dug blindly, sometimes hitting bones, sometimes finding half-rotted corpses that slipped apart as they lifted them. The smell was overpowering. The sounds were worse. The cracking of rib cages, the sucking of wet earth, the slap of a limb falling free. And above it all, the possibility of being caught by watchmen or furious relatives, though in the chaos of plague years, even these risks diminished. Some stories tell of body snatchers who tried to open plague pits, only to find their tools sinking into soft mud. The soil liquefied by decay. One man reportedly lost a boot and part of his leg in the pit, swallowed by the mire of liquefied bodies and rainwater. Others recounted corpses that seemed to groan or sigh as air escaped their lungs during removal. The line between superstition and fact blurred in the minds of those who did this work. Many believed they were cursed, and some may have been. The bodies they retrieved were rarely identified. They were taken to back doors of hospitals, loaded onto carts under tarps, or delivered by night to anatomists who paid in coin and asked no questions. Students and surgeons, desperate to learn, did not care where the corpses came from. All that mattered was that they were whole enough to dissect. These were not murders, they rationalized. The dead were already gone, but the moral lines were fuzzy. Families who had barely managed to bury their loved ones often found graves empty days later. In plague pits, the idea of a grave was already abstract. It was more of a mass deposit, a collective tomb of chaos and tragedy. Ironically, some of the most valuable corpses were those of the infected. Medical students wanted to see the effects of plague on the human body. They examined swollen lymph nodes, blackened skin, and organs riddled with infection. This was dangerous work, of course. Some students fell ill and died, becoming cadavers themselves. But in their minds, knowledge was worth the risk. Progress demanded sacrifice, even if it meant robbing a pit full of plague victims. Not all body snatchers were motivated purely by money. Some were coerced. Poor men with families to feed, orphans taken in by gangs. Even gravediggers who were paid a little extra to turn a blind eye or offer directions. There were even stories of clergymen involved, passing along information about burials to those who would make use of it. The web of complicity was wide and tangled. In a time when survival itself was uncertain, morality often took a back seat. Public outrage over body snatching eventually reached a boiling point. Newspapers told of grieving families finding disturbed graves. Rumors spread of corpses being stolen not just from pits, but from coffins in broad daylight. Riots broke out near hospitals. Graveyards hired armed guards. Watchmen patrolled with dogs. And yet, in the darkness, the snatchers still worked. The need for bodies and medicine did not disappear, and legal reforms were slow in coming. One of the most infamous cases came not from plague pits, but from murder. Burke and Hare, in 19th century Edinburgh, bypassed grave robbing entirely and simply killed people to sell their bodies. Their actions shocked the public into action. In 1832, the Anatomy Act was passed in Britain, allowing doctors to legally access unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals. This reduced the need for body snatching, but it did not erase the long history of digging up the dead. Plague pits are still being discovered today. Construction projects in London and other cities have unearthed these mass graves, sometimes containing hundreds of skeletons. Archaeologists handle them with reverence, uncovering not just bones, but the story of a society overwhelmed by death. And in those layers of the earth, traces of interference are sometimes found. Disordered remains. Skulls missing. Skeletons not aligned as they should be. Quiet reminders of the hands that reached in centuries ago, pulling the dead from their rest for reasons most people could never imagine. There is a strange irony in it all. People dumped into those pits had already suffered in life. Poverty, disease, fear. They died without ceremony and were buried without dignity. Then, long after death, they were stolen once more, prodded and sliced on the tables of men who believed they were advancing science. And maybe they were. Today's medical students study in clean labs with donors who consented. But the path to that ethical clarity was paved with midnight shovels and the cries of the grieving. To walk near one of these old plague pit sites today is to step over unmarked graves. And you might see nothing but grass or concrete, but beneath your feet lie hundreds of souls who knew suffering too intimately. They were victims of pestilence and, in some cases, victims of history itself. The body snatchers are long gone, their names forgotten, their deeds half remembered in ghost stories and old records. But the bones remain, silent, watching, waiting for the living to remember what was done in the name of science and survival. In the darkest hours of the night, thanks for watching this journey into one of the grimmest corners of history. The story of body snatchers and plague pits reminds us how thin the line between desperation and survival can be. These were times when the dead were not allowed to rest, when science, fear, and profit collided in the most unsettling ways. Behind every plague pit lies a haunting silence, not just of disease and mass death, but of those who returned under cover of darkness to disturb what little peace the victims had. If this story gave you chills or made you see history in a new, more human light, you're not alone. These were real people, real bodies, real choices made in the shadows. And though the world has moved on, the echoes of those nights still linger beneath city streets and quiet churchyards. If you enjoyed this dive into the darker side of the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We've got more strange and forgotten stories coming your way. Till then, remember what lies beneath, and the price some paid both in life and in death for progress. Stay curious, stay respectful, and we'll see you in the next one.